book came from, I initially thought that what I wanted to do for myself was to understand a particular period of time right around 2009, 2008, 2009. I was teaching at Princeton University at the time, and everywhere I looked, I was teaching a lot of really privileged white kids, right? And privileged black kids, and they're like, a lot of people were really privileged, not everybody, a whole lot of privilege, right? But all of a sudden, a lot of these white kids were in my classes where I would be doing stuff around education, and they started saying, Professor Rooks, you know, education is the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. You know, it's unfair that a zip code is determining the outcome of students. Schools are unequal. We are failing them. And I initially, in the very first moments that I started to hear this, I was completely taken by this, right? I was like, this is like Freedom Summer, 1964, Mississippi. We got privileged white people who are gonna come from these schools like Princeton and dedicate themselves to actual social justice and change. Like, I was really thrilled with it. But increasingly, I did start to try to ask, well, like, how come right now? Like, all of a sudden, have y'all discovered poor people, right? Have y'all discovered that there are crappy schools, like, somewhere? What has happened that all of you are evangelical in the conversations that you want to have about the necessity of saving these kids in these schools? But the more that I would talk to these students, the more that I came to recognize they didn't know any poor people. Many of them did not know any black people, except the one or two who had been in their AP classes and honors classes. Literally, that is true for many of them. If they had gone to public schools, many of them, they were really high-performing public schools that bore no relationship to the kinds of schools they had now decided that they were gonna fix. And so that became really like trying to understand like that moment in all of these students and what has led to it. And so in having conversations with folks, you know, it became clear, one, that a lot of what they were saying really were almost talking points. Like when I was attuned to it, when I could hear it, I realized that when I would go to see this film, Waiting for Superman, what was coming out of Waiting for Superman was almost exactly what was coming out of my students' mouths, almost verbatim, right? Almost the same lines. The unfinished work of the civil rights movement. Your zip code should not determine what happens to you. And then, right around the same time, Barack Obama comes up with Race to the Top. New Jersey is trying to be one of the first schools to get Race to the Top money. So all over Princeton, and just the news in general, people are talking about, you know, we don't want the zip code to be, you know, we got to do these things. We have to fix these things. Now the new federal policy is going to give us money. It was almost like this mantra. And then Jeffrey Zuckerberg decided on Oprah, I'm going to give $100 million to the New York schools because it's the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. And because we don't want a zip code to determine the education. I was like, okay, wait a minute. All of these folks have not just sort of stumbled upon this same language. These are talking points, right? Like I'm hearing them too many places, too many spaces, the exact, not the same sentiment, the exact same words. And so I started to talk to the students, you know, about, well, so is it, you know, like talk to me about what it is that you're doing. What's the end game? What's the, like, how are you gonna keep this unfinished work from? And increasingly, I started to hear all of the ways that their lack of knowledge about the schools and the communities and the people, just for my students who I was talking with, really was coming out as, you know, black people and poor people really don't care about education. They don't really care about their kids in education. If their kids are going to get an education, we are going to have to go in there and help reform their schools. If their parents cared about them, they would do X, Y, and Z. If the communities cared about them, they wouldn't allow this, this, and that to happen. So increasingly it became placed at the feet of the people who are the victims of the educational system. They were the sole problem, and it was pretty much up to these white students to swoop in and save them, is the kind of language they were using, right? When they would talk about why this needed to happen. And so it was right around then that I decided to write a book. Ashley didn't do any research for years after this, but it was right around then that I was like, I need to understand this moment. And I thought the way to understand it was to back up a little bit and contextualize what had come before, to say, see, look, before it didn't look like this. So this is something new in the 2000s. Like the millennia has brought along all of this interest in Black education, philanthropic money being hurled at these issues around education, government elites and financial elites joining forces to propose policies to fix these schools, right? Like this is all new in my mind. So this is like a narrative of how I came to understand this period. So I was like, well, I'm gonna just back up a little bit and, you know, start and say, well, like in the 1980s, see, it wasn't like this. So there's this move. And so I backed up and started doing research. It's like, yeah, the 1980s, we had the Edison schools, which are the first for-profit. Y'all know what the Edison schools are? I didn't need to talk about it. Everybody's good? Everybody's good? No, some people don't. So the Edison schools are the first for-profit management of poor schools, a company that said, in much the same way, Chris Whittle, who's the founder of the Edison schools, never been a teacher, didn't grow up around any poor people, didn't know anything about Black and Latino people, goes to places like Baltimore, was one of the first places that they came, Philadelphia, New York, you know, and says, you know, we can provide cheaper education and higher quality education than can your school system. So since y'all all broke, you know, legislatures are slashing funding left and right. Y'all are all complaining about teacher pensions. Y'all are all complaining, you know, that the school buildings are bankrupting you. Let us come in and manage the schools for you. And because we're gonna get up to scale, we'll be able to provide sum total of what you need for education, cheaper than you can. They also went to Wall Street and said, you know, we want to get on the stock exchange. We want to be a for-profit company. So they were the first for-profit in business to provide returns for their shareholders. Their primary function, while education was the vehicle that they were using to do it, was to provide profit, right? And so and the places where they were going were all places that were at least 80% or more poor, 80% or more of color, right? Those are the communities that they needed in order to function. So it's like, okay, you can't back up to the 80s and say that this didn't exist then, because look, there's this, and then the Rockefeller Foundation is going, yes, let's give you money to do this, and Wall Street's doing what? So now, like, backing up to the 70s, where you have President Nixon deciding in the 1970s that, he decided a lot of things, but around education and busing in particular, he decided that I'm gonna make sure that suburban areas, that white areas that are suburban with a high tax base do not have to participate in desegregation efforts. And in order to decide that, you had people like Joe Biden, our former vice president, coming up with bills. He got a lot of help from Democrats, Nixon did. They're coming up with bills saying, Joe Biden said, well, we're gonna make it illegal to put gas, to pay for gas with federal dollars to put in buses if the purpose of the bus and the gas is to desegregate schools, right? Nixon decided, I'm gonna let suburban areas opt out of desegregation in the way that I'm gonna make it palatable is I'm gonna say I'm gonna give more money to urban school districts. So if black folks will stay put, if poor folks will stay put, we will give you an influx of cash. Much of it was coming from foundations, from different government entities, so it's sort of like, okay, this is not the moment where there's this sort of widespread interest in the education of black people. Long story short, I backed up all the way to Reconstruction. Kept trying to look for these moments before all of this was happening. I backed up to Reconstruction, and in Reconstruction, education is great. You of course have federal troops in the South with guns, making sure that money and education and space is being regulated. However, you know, poor white people and black people are learning at crazy rates during this period of time. Because there's enough money to educate everybody, because the federal government is pumping it into the South as a way of stabilizing the region post-Civil War, right? So for that 8 years, 10 years or so, it's really great. Voting rights are going through the roof, and educational justice is a real thing. And one of the things that taught me, having to back up that far, really was that voting rights and educational justice go hand in hand in ways that we don't often talk about, right? At moments in this country's history when everybody can vote, when democracy is strong, when we are having conversations about what it looks like and who it should serve, we are also, as a nation, having conversations about what education should look like. When we're at moments where we're trying to hoard democracy, right, where certain groups are hoarding democracy for themselves, you also have a hoarding of educational resources. So what the whole project ended up being is a history of race and education and democracy through this lens of privatization. I came up with this term, segronomics, to talk about one of the things that we need to pay some attention to as we have conversations about segregation. Segronomics talks about business strategy, educational strategies, but other things as well. But in this context, about educational strategies that just don't work in the absence of high levels of racial and economic segregation. Think TFA, right? Think a lot of the wealthy charter school chains. The wealthy charter school chains will tell you we need 90-90-90 schools in order to be successful. What those are schools that are 90% of color, 90% below federally set poverty levels, and 90% underperforming, right? That's what's required for them to do well. TFA is $400 million, and the last time I looked at their annual report, they had about $400 million available to them. Most of the neighborhoods, they started off being real interested in rural areas. These days, most of the neighborhoods where they are again, neighborhoods with these levels of inequality. Their business model doesn't work in the absence of those high levels of segregation. And so one of the questions that I end up asking and sort of teasing through the rest of this history is if one of the reasons it's so difficult for us to eradicate segregation, to actually make inroads, is that there's some really powerful people making a ton of money off of it. And we don't often talk about it like that. We talk about segregation as a moral or ethical imperative. We've not really looked at the business of segregation. And there's no place to start that's sort of more salient than to look at education and again the history. This is not new. I don't have time to tell you all the moments in all of the ways, but it's not new. And the one thing that actually works to educate the groups of students who we say we can't educate is integration, not because black kids and poor kids sitting next to rich white people is some sort of magical fix, but because it forces the hoarding of resources that is taking place in that kind of segregated space. In rich, wealthy, white spaces, it forces a sharing of those resources. And that's why systemically, integration has worked. Again, there's not some magical, oh, wait.